Hey, welcome back to episode 2 of Turn Bark Time. I'm the Turn,
I'm the Bark.
and we're still over here for a long time. So, what we're here today to cover. By the way, thank you for watching. We are going to compare the COVID-19 virus to pandemics that the world has seen before. And this was a question submitted by one of Mr. Barker's students. So awesome job. Again, feel free to email us questions or anything like that. We're always looking for new topics to talk about. So we kind of sat down and talked about it, and we divided this into 4 major pandemics. So the first one is the plague of Justinian.
So the plague of Justinian happened in the year 541 CE or AD, or whichever one you want to use. And it's really similar to another one we're going to talk about here in a minute. So it literally is what's called plague, which is a bacterial infection. It's a bacteria that lives normally inside of like fleas or lice. That's called
Yersinia pestis.
Yeah. And so it lives in the, like, inside the bellies or like the stomachs of like fleas. And as they get it from rats, they bite rats and then they jump off the rats and get onto other people. So it's estimated that go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So again, this is what we're going to find here is it's a basis in the Byzantine Empire. So if you don't know what that is, it's the Eastern Roman Empire, so its base is in Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, Turkey, and then spans around the Mediterranean in Europe and North Africa is the area we're talking about.
And so the first area that they recorded the plague showing up was in northern Egypt. Again, they blamed it on rats coming in grain shipments through the Mediterranean. Then they brought it from Egypt up into Constantinople, and then through wars of the time, because the Roman Empire was constantly being attacked. When you're so big, you have to try and defend a giant country, and they did their best. But because they were sending soldiers all across the empire, as well as sending food all across the empire, because it was also during a cold snap where the weather was colder than it normally was. So like crops were bad across the northern part of the empire. So a lot more trade was coming out of North Africa into the northern empire.
So again, one of the big things is this plague, as it spreads through these grain ships that were paid for tribute, is going to infect about half the population of Europe at the time. And at the height of the plague, it was said that inside the walls of Constantinople, again, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, was averaging about 5,000 deaths per day. And again, this is this is during the height of the plague. The plague itself runs about 50 years is what the number we kind of found closest to. And the overall death count, probably it's going to affect, again, half the population of Europe, but that's not going to be the mortality rate. We're talking about 25, 50 million people total in that 50-year period. So definitely one of the first ones the world has seen. However, again, not the first time that we've seen a plague like this. There's been other ones, but again, lesser numbers because of relevant data and information from the time period.
And so if you fast forward from this about 800 years, you get the Black Death in Europe, which is what everybody's familiar with, which happens around the 1300s. And it's the same bacteria coming back into Europe. Again, the accepted historical thought is that it's from rats. There are some alternate theories floating around now that it could have been brought by lice on people rather than fleas from rats. The original thought was that the fleas were on the rats. They killed all the rats. Then the fleas jumped onto the people. but there's some scientists that are speculating now that the transmission rate that they saw it wouldn't happen fast enough to have the spread that it did inside that empire at that time, or inside Europe at that time.
And there are three types of plague, as we're using the term. The Yersinia pestis. There's pneumonic, which is in your lungs, so it's a lung infection. There's septicemic, which is a blood infection. And then the most common and another term for the Black Death is the bubonic plague. And bubonic plague hits your nodes, your lymph nodes, causing swelling and different things like that. The interesting thing and a comparison point to kind of the COVID virus is bubonic plague does have similar symptoms of the flu, being things like vomiting, fever, inducing. Obviously, plague is different in the type of the overall way the virus reacts with the body and creates symptoms.
Also need to understand that medicine at the time was not what we have today. They were still operating on the old Greek thought of the body had 4 different humors in it. So you had to have a balance in your body of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And one of their common solutions to any sickness, and this goes all the way up, they did it with George Washington right before he died, is bloodletting. It's the idea that there was too much blood in the body, and that was creating an imbalance. So during the plague, they were actually having people, when they went to a doctor, the help they got wasn't probably, by our modern standards, very helpful at all. But back then, that was the best that they thought that they could do. And then at some point, doctors even just said they just stopped seeing patients because it became too hazardous for them.
And I was reminded of this actually because one of my favorite scenes from Monty Python and the Quest for the Holy Grail is the guy, "Bring out your dead, bring out your dead."
But I'm not dead yet.
You will be soon. All in all serious note, again, 2/3 of Europe is the estimate in death total for this group. Going off of census data, again, these are estimated world populations at the time, but they found it from the Census Bureau. Is in 1340, the estimated world population, according to them, was 443 million people in the whole world. Around the time of the 1400, the estimate is 350 million people. So again, you're talking roughly 93 million people death. And bubonic plague still exists. It's been found. It's mostly found the origin spot in Central Asia is where it's believed. And again, scholars for the Black Death actually think Mongolia was the spot that it started because China recorded a high number of deaths in Mongolia during the 1330s, obviously a little bit before the Black Death makes it to Europe. It's thought that the Mongols then attack a Italian outpost in Merchant Center where they were trading. Those merchants bring it back all the way to Genoa, and it works its way through Italy and then Europe with its devastation.
They were catapulting dead bodies over the walls because the Mongol army was sick with the plague, and they were about ready to give up. And that was kind of their final salute to the Genoese, was to catapult infected bodies into the city before they pulled back.
So speaking of that method of biological warfare, we're going to bring up a biological warfare that just makes you feel warm and cozy inside, and that's giving blankets to people. And so our third pandemic that we're talking about is actually a really long pandemic. It's believed to be 12,000 years. In terms of recorded cases that we can look for, it's been about 2,278 years, and that is smallpox. And the smallpox virus, again, the first time that's believed to be recorded is in the 3rd century BCE on mummies in Egypt. There's evidence, again, with mummification, the preservation of bodies, that there were sores and things like that are similar to smallpox. And so this is going to be a devastating pandemic, again, that's going to last. The last case is in 1978. So.
And when we think about it, we often talk about Columbus and the European exchange with the New World. And there's a kind of a concept called the virgin soil concept, where essentially the Native Americans in North and South America didn't have any contact or extended contact with anybody in Europe, Africa, or Asia, which were all trading and living with large domesticated animals to a higher extent than the people were in North and South America. The only domesticatable animal in the Americas was the llama down in Peru, in the Andes Mountains.
No drama.
And so because of that, the Europeans, or Afro-Eurasians, if you want to put them all in one boat, are essentially like a lot dirtier in the sense that they've been, like, we'll talk about it when we get to talk about COVID, but like a lot of these diseases start in animals and then somehow mutate and then begin to spread to humans. And the Europeans had a, thousands of years of a head start of living with these kind of with diseases like smallpox. And it was completely new to the native populations of the Americas, which is why it led to millions. It's really hard because Native Americans didn't write things down and they weren't one homogenous group and didn't keep statistics. But it decimated, I think Jared Diamond postulates 90% of the native population of the Americas.
And again, devastating effects. So a lot of this stuff came across, and when we look at the first epidemic, I guess, in the Americas, really takes place in Tenochtitlan, with Hernan Cortez's men bringing it to the city, and again, devastating the population. Smallpox continues to be a big issue. Actually, interferes with the U.S. Revolution. Washington and his army is fighting at Valley Forge during the worst smallpox epidemic of the Americas. And up through the 17th century, my apologies. Yeah, the 18th century, it was estimated that around 400,000 people a year died from the disease of smallpox. And it's interesting because I believe it's eradicated. Is that the word, right?
Yeah, that's what the CDC uses.
Yeah, so it's been eradicated. And the last case is actually really interesting. You want to go ahead and tell them about that last case?
Yeah, there was a female nurse who essentially got like a fever, got really, really sick, and then was living with her mom, and her mom took her to the hospital. The woman died, and yay, rainbows. But what happened was the lab below her was working with smallpox, and somehow through the air ducting of the medical center or the university, it went up through the air ducts, and then she was infected with smallpox and died of smallpox. It was like decades after it had been taken care of.
Yep.
So
it's interesting again. So smallpox has ravaged roughly 12,000 years is what we think. Again, for evidence, we're talking almost 2,300 years and killing millions of people. I believe the estimate that I saw, I believe it was a New York Times article comparing all the diseases, had 20 to 50 million, I believe, on their list for smallpox. So last one we're going to talk about is actually the most relatable. We were discussing this earlier in the sense that it's the first time the United States government exists and has interaction with a pandemic.
And so that's the Spanish flu of 1918. It was when we talk about flus, we always kind of give them a name as far as H number, N number, and that refers to different kinds of proteins that are on the outside of the influenza virus. And so it was an H1N1, which I think often is called bird flu, but it depends on there's a lot of different variations inside of those kind of big categories. And so this happened right at the tail end of World War I, which kind of really allowed it to spread on the down low until it was a big enough problem that people realized that they probably should have done something earlier.
And the misnomer here is that it's called the Spanish flu, and the origin actually is unknown of where it came from. The reason it's called the Spanish flu, which I'm sure you've seen as the COVID comparison articles come out, is that Spain was neutral at the time of World War I. And so they didn't have any censorship on any of their press. So they're talking about there's this terrible flu over here. And everyone's like, we don't have that. We don't have that. It must be your flu. It's Spanish flu. But that's the origins that I believe started in the United States in Kansas at a military outpost. There was a huge problem with the flu. In the UK and being brought over by soldiers who were stationed in France, there was a big breakout there. And the last option is China, and not necessarily China itself had a problem with this, as more as the Chinese laborers who were working in World War I were near that outpost where that British outbreak occurred. So those are kind of the three areas we think this bleed, but again, misnomer with the Spanish flu didn't start in Spain. Spain could just tell the world about it.
Fun fact, in Spain, they actually called it the Naples Soldier, which was a song that was really popular from an opera of the time. But they said it was kind of a pun because they said it's really catching. It's catching on. So instead of calling it the flu, they called it a little dark humor. They called it the Naples Soldier because it was everybody was getting it.
Jesus, new appreciation for Spanish right there. Infection rate. It's estimated that 500 million people were infected, or a third of the world's population at the time. Deaths from it range from 50 to 60 million. What's unique about this pandemic, in terms of like other ones that are I don't want to say more minor, because obviously people die in a pandemic, but they were less deadly or less reported on. This one had a high death rate for healthy people. There was kind of you've seen like the curve, they've talked about the infection curve, and it goes up and then down, right? And that usually, for mortality, what we do is we usually just draw kind of a line out and then up. Well, what happened here was there'd be a line out, and then when you got to about 20, the line went up and then climbed down to about 40, and then went up again at about 65. So there was a population from 20 to 40 years old that was healthy Americans, or healthy, I should say, world population, that were dying from this disease, which led to its high numbers.
Some people postulate it was because the young people did have such a good immune system that actually was their undoing. So the flu would infect the lungs, and your body releases. We're not doctors. Things called cytokines. And they come in and they try and like trigger your body to like find the foreign thing and get rid of it. And the byproduct of that is it starts releasing a lot of fluid into your lungs, and on a kind of micro level, all of that additional fluid in the body, because the lungs, the virus hijacks the lung cells and replicates, and then the lung cells are dead, so the lungs are weakened and they can't regulate that fluid. You essentially start suffocating on your own, like bodily fluids in your lungs. They I was watching a documentary today, and they talked about how people would just start turning blue because of a lack of oxygen, and they would essentially just like toe tag them and get them ready for the morgue, even though they weren't dead yet, because they knew that they couldn't stop the process at that point.
Yeah. So again, what was the United States reaction at this point? Well, one of the big issues was you had a war fighting. You can't be limited, and you can't give away any weaknesses. And again, this flu, being how fast it spread, would have been considered a huge weakness. And so the United States government actually kind of hushed it, like, and went after people who were really upset about, and were like, no, we need to talk about this flu. They'd be like, we're not talking about it right now. We got to win a war. And so again, you can't judge people based on their time because you weren't there. But this led to big parades being thrown when soldiers would come home, and people would be traveling around everywhere, and we had all these people in Europe still. And so basically the United States government allowed these things to happen. One of the estimates I saw was there wasn't anybody sick in the time in Philadelphia, and they were going to hold this big parade, and all the doctors were like, hey, you need to stop this, don't do it. And they were like, no, we're fine, we're healthy, you're not going to talk about that. and they had the big parade, and then 65,000 people ended up passing away because of the H1N1.
I was watching a documentary that was made in the I think like 2009. It's kind of interesting because it has Fauci in it, the guy who's currently doing a lot of the speaking right now from the National Health Institute, which is where he was at this time as well. But it was talking about, it was city by city. So like while Philadelphia did a really bad job, St. Louis on the like flip side did a really good job. And what they did is they started doing things where they were like, keep social distance, close schools, tell people to stay home. Like all of the things that we're hearing right now essentially is what St. Louis did early and then had it hold over later. And that really reduced the amount of exposure so people getting sick. I want to say the University of Michigan has a really good article on it. And they said that San Francisco essentially let their people out. They thought things were okay, and so they let everybody out. And then it upticked again, and they said, I want to say it was 90% of the fatalities in San Francisco could have been prevented if they would have stayed, like kept people like locked down longer. You know, but as Americans, you don't tell me how to live my life. I'll do what I want. You know, it's kind of the problem is that we're so used to having so much freedom that sometimes we don't know what's the best thing to do for ourselves.
Yeah. So that leads us perfectly right into COVID. So these numbers will easily change by the time that this gets posted to YouTube and you guys even watch it. But as the numbers that I pulled, we have 307,037 positive cases of the coronavirus in the world. Of those cases that tested positive, 95,795 of them have recovered. At this moment, 13,034 deaths have occurred because of the coronavirus. China leads the world in cases, obviously the epicenter. Italy is now coming second. I'm sure we've heard about Italy and the trouble they're having. Hopefully, again, that turns around for them. The United States has the third most. And this I found interesting. You don't hear a lot about them. Spain actually has the fourth most cases of COVID in the world. So I was really surprised by that. And then Germany rounds out the top five with 22,364. So those are the top five. One more that's still in the 20,000s is Iran. So again, the top six are all in the of 20,000 and above, but after that it drops off. So comparing to other numbers and infection rates, as you can see, not really comparable in terms of numbers at this moment. Obviously, there's a whole year happened in 1918, smallpox a long time, Black Death a long time. So
one of the things to talk about, a lot of people are like, why is COVID so different? And COVID is really the name of the complications that come from the actual virus. The actual virus has been classified as SARS-CoV-2. And for older people, not our students, you weren't around quite yet or old enough to remember, SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, which happened in the early 2000s. It was a virus that came out of China, had a very high mortality rate, but it didn't spread as fast as this coronavirus does. And then there was also MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, that came out in like 2013, like a year after I left the Middle East. And a lot of coronaviruses they speculate come from bats. They naturally live in the bodies of bats, and their immune system can handle them and suppress them, and it doesn't cause the bats any grief. And then what happens is the bat somehow interacts with another animal, like bites an animal, and then it transmits to that intermediate animal, and then from that animal it mutates again to spread to humans. And so this is you keep hearing the term novel, meaning that it's a new strain of a coronavirus. And so it's very similar to 1918, where we don't have a vaccine, we don't have like a medicine that's specifically designed to help mitigate this virus, which is why we're being asked to essentially, Grant County said, if you're over 65 or if you're compromised, you should be sheltering in place, meaning you should be staying home. And the reason for that is that, like the flu normally spreads. There's a kind of a spread factor that they use called R naught, and it was a 1.3 or 1.4 for the flu, and they think that COVID is at least that and could be all the way up to almost 4, meaning that for every person who has it, they can infect 4 people before they know that they have the virus. And it also has an incubation period where you can spread it to a lot of people before you realize that you actually have, COVID. And so because of those 2 factors, it's really spreadable, like Nutella, and that it takes a while for you to realize that you're sick. That's what makes it so hard to kind of track where you got it, because it might be somebody that you met a week ago who was there for 5 minutes, and you have to try and retrace where was everybody. And Grant County Health's trying to do a good job of telling people where things are at, where people were that are infected. But that's really what's making it difficult. And that's why the government really is pushing and trying to ask us to make good decisions as individuals. That's what Jay Inslee keeps saying, like, follow the rules and I won't have to, declare a lockdown, essentially, a shelter in place for everybody in the state like Oregon did.
Well, it's hard too. So I don't know. I felt like these, when we talk about the spreadability of it, I mean, we've seen that in our own community, how quickly, those numbers are rising. We had the 1 case on the eastern side of the state, first, fatality, unfortunately. But we've increased that number already. I believe we're up to 5 cases, actually 6 cases, I believe. And most like
double digits now in Grant County.
Yeah. So I know Moses Lake had their first case. I was just talking about for the city of Quincy, but because we're so small as it is. What's unique about this as well is that, so my girlfriend asked me, she goes, if the numbers trended and continued, what would the total number be? And again, I'm not a science researcher or a mathematician. I know I'm looking at my numbers now and realizing that this is probably wrong, because it would be an even number. So I'm not even going to give the statistic because it doesn't make sense, because I didn't do exponential, like my math teachers at Quincy Middle School will remind me, is the different way that you should do this, not through just basic division. So looking at this, again, from what Bark and I have seen, there's the pandemic of 1918 is the most comparable to what we can say today. However, the COVID numbers are low right now, and I feel like the reaction between Spanish flu or pandemic of 1918 compared to COVID is we're on track right now. The world's on track to keep COVID way under that number.
And part of that is because we have technology and we can communicate and share data way faster. But there's also, I was reading an article today where they're saying, oh, the Russians are doing such a great job of, they prevented COVID. And then there's, right after that, they were like, well, but that could be that Russia's not telling us the truth. So there's kind of the media right now is kind of trying to give facts, but then they also kind of like stoke the fear. Like Seattle Times had a headline that was like, things could get really bad if, and then it like, if things get really bad. But it's like at this point right now, we're trying to do a lot of the preventative stuff, like they talked about with like St. Louis, preventing people from being out at social gatherings, limiting group sizes. We're down to, I think, the state of Washington said 5 or 10, and then I think President Trump said 5. Yeah. So, I mean, like if you're within, this isn't a time to go hang out at the park and be like right next to all your buddies, because that prevents, that's not social distance. What we're doing right now is social distance. We're together, but we're still really far away and we can't touch each other.
Yep.
Right.
So again, like going out there and talking about this, numbers look, better than obviously pandemic. It is a pandemic, but look better than the 1918. And again, we should have probably let off with this. A pandemic at this point, the World Health Organization called it because it infected more than 100 countries in the world. So again, plague of Justinian, Black Death, same disease, different time periods. Smallpox ravaged the world, and the Spanish flu, or the pandemic of 1918, rounds out our top 4 pandemics. And COVID hopefully will not rise to any 4 of these occasions. Next week, look forward to a Boston Massacre discussion on the inaccuracies. Until then, I'm Turn.
I'm Bark.
We're going to turn bark time. Have a good night.
If you guys have ideas for other topics, submit them in the comments.